All right, welcome back to Live Impact News. We want to talk about a very sad case that we've been covering here at 13 News Now. 1 year ago today, a lovely, beautiful young woman, only 21 years old, Angelina Resendiz, was killed. A Navy sailor, a case that we have been covering since that time. Her body was found about 2 weeks after she was reported missing, and found like 10 miles from Naval Station Norfolk. And since then, another fellow sailor, Jermiah Copeland, has been arrested and charged in her death. He is reportedly going to be taking a plea deal pretty soon. And we've been in touch with her mother over the last year, Esmeralda Castle, an amazing woman who has shown tremendous resolve and determination to find justice for her daughter. She even ran for Congress down in Texas because of some of the issues that surfaced behind this case, and her difficulty in trying to get answers and her quest to try to keep this from happening to somebody else. Madison Schlegel, our reporter here at 13 News Now, she has done a tremendous job covering this story. She joins us now on this 1 year tragic anniversary. Madison, thank you so much. You have really been on this case. You have done a wonderful job, and staying in contact with the family. I can only imagine, I have a 22-year-old daughter, and so it makes me emotional just thinking about it. So talk about the 1 year anniversary and what's to come with the plea deal.
Yeah, so we just learned this last week. Actually, I had a conversation with Esmeralda. Like you had mentioned, she was running for a representative seat in Texas, and her that election
state, right?
Yes,
okay.
yes. That election was on Tuesday that happened. She unfortunately lost her race, but I called her on Sunday to kind of catch up with her, talk with her ahead of the election, just to see what was going on. And in our almost hour-long conversation that we had, she had divulged to me that the Navy had told both her and her attorney that Jermiah Copeland is expected to take a plea deal when he goes to court next month. So originally we know this was supposed to be a 2-week trial that was scheduled by the Navy, in which the trial counsel and the prosecution there was going to line out all of the charges that Jermiah Copeland faces, not just with Angelina Resendiz, but a handful of other women who had come forward and had previously reported assault by him that he was actually being investigated for at the time that Angelina Resendiz was killed. So she had divulged that information to me, that he has been talking about wanting to do a plea deal, and that the Navy had mentioned that he might be accepting 40 years for the death of Angelina Resendiz. Now, this situation is a little sticky right now, right? Because none of this is set in stone yet. So Jermiah Copeland is set to be in court on June 8th.
Okay.
And on June 8th, the attorney for Angelina Resendiz's family, Marshall Griffin, says that that's when they expect that plea deal to be entered. So a handful of things will happen then. They'll do what's called the Providency hearing, where the military judge actually has to ask Copeland a slew of questions that prove his guilt. In the military, it could be a very coercive environment. People are ordered to do things. And this type of fail-safe is kind of in place to make sure that he's not admitting to something that he really didn't do.
Right.
So after I got off the phone with Esmeralda Castle and learning this, because we've been reaching out to the Navy for months to get more information about this, or even to get solidified dates on when that trial was going to happen. The last preliminary hearing that was had was back in March, and since that date back in March, we've been working with the Navy to try to get more details.
Yeah.
They've gone radio silent on us.
Wow.
So when we learned this information from Esmeralda Castle and the family attorney, immediately I reached out to the Navy and was like, hey, what's going on? Again, they haven't really been able to divulge much information, but that's because, again, this is all up in the air right now. We don't really know how it's going to happen, and the state of this deal is really fragile, because he could show up on June 8th, and it could be a change of heart, a change of mind by both him and his defense attorneys that, hey, maybe he doesn't want to make a plea agreement today. But from the words that they've heard from the Navy so far, they have gotten that word. And I've sat down and done interviews with Esmeralda and Marshall Griffin since I spoke with them on Sunday. And one thing that I love about talking with Marshall Griffin is that he really does boil it down in lay terms for people who might not understand.
That's always good. Yeah.
Yeah, for some of these intricacies that we've got going on when it comes to the court system. This is my first military court case that I've ever covered. So it's been really interesting to see the different ways in which they kind of handle their proceedings. But I had some questions as to, Marshall, how is this all going to play out? How does a judge prove that he's guilty beyond the evidence that the prosecution is kind of bringing to the table here? Well, like I had mentioned, they do what's called a providency hearing, again, where there's a slate of questions that the judge has to ask for Copeland to kind of prove that guilt. I know we've got a slew of sound that I've kind of put in the can for our producer Samantha to kind of pull up. And so I guess I just ask at this moment so we can take a second to kind of get some of his professional context. Yeah. If we could, Samantha, bring up that sound about the providency hearing situation that Marshall Griffin, the attorney for the Resendiz family, has kind of told us about what's expected to happen on that June 8th date. Take a listen.
Okay.
The military is very different because it's a coercive environment where people can be ordered to do things and have a legal obligation to follow those orders. So the military judge has a special obligation to ensure that the accused is pleading guilty, not because someone has ordered them to do so or coerced them to do so, that they're pleading guilty because they in fact believe they are guilty. So that adds this process that's unique to military jurisprudence called providency. It's a providency inquiry, and it's a very detailed inquiry into the offense and the accused's belief about their role in that offense.
So again, you kind of heard it there from his professional opinion, not opinion, but facts about what is expected to happen on that June 8th date. But again, the state of that deal, really fragile right now, Janet.
Okay, but he does explain it well, and it's understandable that they would need to ask those questions. So if he takes a plea deal, you mentioned before we came on that a lot of the evidence and, the how and when and where, that kind of thing, won't necessarily come out because you won't have the trial. With all the conversations that you've had with Ms. Castle, do you think that a plea deal is what she prefers? I mean, is there pain? Obviously, it would be very painful to sit through a trial like that. I mean, I can only imagine. How does she feel about a plea deal versus a trial?
Well, I was actually sitting in the courtroom behind Esmeralda Castle that day at the original Article 32 hearing where she learned all of these details with us. And watching her reaction is something that, it sticks with you. Just to see all of the evidence being laid out and for her to finally get some answers about what happened to her daughter. Since she has been working from a place of advocacy and forgiveness and wanting to take some time, not only to see the humanity in the situation itself, but also find humanity for Copeland, which is just a really harrowing statement to even think about. But the difference here with a plea deal and also if this were to go to trial, again, Janet, like you had mentioned, publicly we would get to see all of that information and evidence that the trial counsel had originally laid out against Copeland. And for the handful of people that were in the room that day of that Article 32 hearing, we got to hear all of those details. It's like my mind's like a steel vault, some of that information that you learn it truly does stick with you. I think what's interesting here, and I think what Esmeralda Castle has told me is advantageous for a plea deal, is that she gets to hear firsthand from Copeland him taking some sort of accountability for the actions that happened a year ago. And for her, she has big questions for him too, because she wants to know. There was a Navy chief who had come into the room that morning of May 29th who had previously said that he saw Angelina. Now, whether she was alive or not at that moment, it truly is unclear, and the only person who has that answer is Jermiah Copeland. So Esmeralda Castle and also Marshall Griffin, the family attorney, have told me that the Navy has kind of floated the idea that if there is a plea agreement here, that she could have the opportunity to sit down one-on-one with him.
Wow.
And have a conversation with him. And it gives you chills to think about it, you know, to see that the advocacy that she's done for other families who have been in the same situation has given her this outside perspective of, no, I really do want to sit down and find out the real nitty-gritty of what happened that day, no matter how hard or difficult to hear. And I think that that type of sentiment has been left with every single person that Esmeralda has had contact with since her daughter's death. Because one thing that many people can say about her is the fact that she's able to keep going after learning all of these details, after knowing what happened, after knowing her daughter was missing for 2 weeks, knowing that it was children in a forest who found a suitcase and came across it, and they were the ones that had found her. It weighs heavy on you. I mean, again, Janet, you mentioned having a daughter and having kids too, and I'm young. Children aren't in my future yet, but I could only imagine the gravitas of learning those details and then being able to sit down and have a full-fledged conversation with the person that you know has done it. And again, I've got more sound that Samantha has queued up here that we can kind of pull up, because I know the other day when I did the update on this case in the studio before we had gone on, you and I were kind of talking.
Right.
There's so much anger and there's so much feeling that you could let really overtake your life and overdrive your life.
Control you. Yeah.
And what are you to do in those moments when you see that your life has crumbled in front of you and you're the one that's left to pick up the pieces?
Right.
And I think forgiveness for Esmeralda Castle has been something that's really helped her do all this work. And in an interview that I did with her just a few days ago, she spoke to me about that type of forgiveness. And if we wouldn't mind just taking a second just to hear words from her.
Let's hear that.
All right, looks like Samantha's working to pull that up here. We're doing everything on the fly, everybody. So this is kind of work with us while we're doing this. But
okay, I think it's coming up now.
I can't let this, eat my life away, right? Like, to hold that, like, I was, you're angry, it hurts, but you have to. I know who I am, right? Like, we're more than this. Like, I've not realized that it's been
from her, and how she can get to that place is truly so strong. And I think Marshall Griffin, the attorney for the family, also in my sit-down interview with him had mentioned how that was probably one of the most awe-inspiring things that's come from this case, is working with Esmeralda Castle and to see the trail that she's blazed over the last year for advocacy.
Yeah, and that's probably just her way of trying to, something that's eating you up so much in the pain, is to her way of trying to find some kind of peace, some kind of way to deal with something that is so tragic. And you're right, anger, and people say that, when you're angry, that controls you. And it's that thing that weighs on you and sits on your shoulder, and it's always there, and so at some point you have to say, how do I get rid of this? And she's thinking, she's had so much time to think, and ponder this over and over and over in her brain. And she's thinking, probably the only way I can do this, is there a way I can figure out how to forgive this guy for what he did to my daughter, which is just, it's admirable, it's courageous, it's brave. I can keep coming up with the adjectives to try to explain that.
Those are the perfect words to use. And we also have sound from Marshall Griffin in reacting to the last year of working with Esmeralda Castle. I asked him, did you expect that a year ago when you took on this case pro bono, keep in mind, he's doing this pro bono, and also he's typically a defense attorney. So he's typically working for the person on the other side of the case here. And I kind of want to give a snapshot about what he said about the last year of working with Esmeralda. So Samantha, if you wouldn't mind playing that for us.
All right.
The thing that has struck me that I think is just incredibly compelling, that most people might not expect to see, is the level of compassion that she's had for Mr. Copeland. She's expressed that to me a number of times. When she saw him in court, she remarked immediately, "Marshall, he's so young." And I think the degree of compassion, because that's counterintuitive, right? To imagine a mom that's looking at the person who's accused of killing her daughter, to be able to feel any of that is so remarkable. And just to see her strength and her maturity and just the way she has looked at this case and seen the equities and been able to rationally kind of analyze those, she is a perfect person to weigh in and advocate for other people.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah, it's definitely something that a lot of people are watching, people that she is completely unaware of, who are learning and watching her story and are learning from it and actually finding some sort of healing for themselves, or some sort of, internal understanding, for themselves. You never know how you can touch people, and I'm sure that she is probably touching a lot of people with just her resolve.
Well, and that's what she's told me. I mean, she's gone to conferences after meetups, after having conversations with service members and women who are in the service as well. And one striking fact that she told me is that every woman that I've spoken to who's been in the service either has a personal story of assault or has a story of someone they know and love who has experienced assault in the military. And her telling Angelina's story has given people the courage to stop her and tell their story, which is something that I don't think that she ever thought would happen. I mean, across this entire year, she's also worked with LULAC, the League of United Latin American Citizens.
I was going to ask you about LULAC, yes.
Yeah, she's worked with the League of United Latin American Citizens, and they're the same group that took up the Vanessa Guillen case when that happened, and moved to push legislation in order to make sure that there were fail-safes in place to protect women, and especially Latin American women, again, like Angelina Resendiz was. And moving forward with LULAC and alongside with other representatives in the state of Texas, and also we've heard word from Tim Kaine and Mark Warner out here, there have been letters drafted to Congress in order to do an independent investigation of what happened to Angelina Resendiz, not just the nitty-gritty of the details of what Jermiah Copeland is alleged to have done, but more of how the Navy's checks and balances kind of went about declaring Angelina missing. For a while, she was just declared AWOL, which just kind of, in Navy's terms, is like, she didn't show up to work today, and she might just be somewhere, but we're not saying that she's missing yet. It actually took her friends in the service to go to the Norfolk Police Department to actually report her as missing before she truly was reported missing.
Wow.
As she was reported, that was reported by the same friend that she called that night on the late hours of, the early hours of May 29th and the late hours of May 28th, that friend that she called for help, "Hey, please pick me up, something is not right." Her last words on that phone call being, "Please come quick, I love you."
Oh, wow.
And her pleas in that phone call and those pleas stuck with her friend. And that was the same friend who had contacted her mom, Esmeralda, and said, "Hey, something isn't right here. They keep saying that she just hasn't shown up for work, but as someone who knows her, this just isn't like her." And that's what started this snowballing of searching. And again, it wasn't the Navy who was searching for her yet. It was the Norfolk Police Department who was searching for her. And I think that type of gap in the Navy's system was what LULAC was really, really fighting to get more answers for, because they didn't understand why they weren't looking into the fact that someone who didn't have a record of being AWOL, just not showing up to work, what her reasoning would be for just not being there for a slew of days. And they had connected that to the fact that Copeland also didn't show up to work for a couple days, so they had thought maybe they just ran away together, maybe they were just gone together, maybe X, Y, and Z. But in the details that we learned at court, he didn't show up to work because he was doing his own type of forensics in his own bedroom. And you know, just the details of having to haul Angelina out of the barracks was where they alleged that she was killed, hauling her out of the barracks into his friend's Jeep, driving the Jeep, tracking a field or a residential area with a wooded forest in his phone where they pinned. He drove to that location, was in the forest for about 10-15 minutes, came back to his car, and then stopped at a McDonald's before he went back to the barracks. And again, learning all of these details, knowing the fact that everybody kind of had questions about what was going on. I think what Esmeralda Castle and LULAC are also fighting for is just to see some transparency in the Navy's process here of how this kind of breaks down, especially when it comes to the accountability of the officer who was in that room the morning of May 29th who alleges that he saw Angelina. And that's why they didn't report her missing, because allegedly he had seen her. She was up enough to just say, hey, hi, but it was just in passing. And the whole situation was kind of weird, which his roommates the roommates had kind of described the situation that morning. It's just really bizarre. And again, I've got the details, and I won't lay them out here, all of them for you, because some of it just is too graphic. But again, without a trial here, these details don't come out to the public. And so the public might not learn exactly what happened to Angelina Resendiz in specific. We might learn some of those answers on June 8th when Jermiah Copeland answers some of those Providency inquiry questions. But the details of this and the details of the other assaults, of the other women, the cases in which he was already being investigated for.
And that's what I wanted you to talk about more, because when you said just a little while ago that they thought maybe they ran off together, and I guess they didn't connect the dots, you know, right then and there, wait a minute, this is a young man who is under investigation for ...
In multiple cases, not just one.
In multiple cases. And you think, can you talk a little bit more? What do you know about those cases?
Yeah, so all of those instances were lined out in the charge sheets, which were handed out to us that day at court at that original Article 32 hearing. What we did kind of learn is that the assaults date all the way back to when he was on board the Harry S. Truman back in 2024. He was stationed there, and he assaulted a woman in July of 2024 aboard the ship. And that was reported by not her, but her boyfriend. She came home and told her boyfriend what had happened, and her boyfriend was the one that reported the assault. And then the initial inquiry or investigation had kind of started. But post that, when the Harry S. Truman was also over in Norway, at a bar in Norway, he had assaulted another sailor, an instance where this young woman, who was also a service woman, was under the influence, was a little intoxicated, and to the point where Jermiah Copeland had followed her into a bathroom and had assaulted her and took video of the assault. And it wasn't until the next morning when her friends had said, hey, do you know that this is going around, that she even found out what had happened to her? She didn't even know what had happened. And so this video was circulating, and again, that was reported to the Navy, and at that point, he had kind of had a little bit of a mental break on the ship because, again, he was being investigated for that first case, and then this case had happened in Norway, and then he had a little bit of a mental breakdown, and that's when they sent him from the ship, the Harry S. Truman, and they brought him back to Naval Station Norfolk. Well, at Naval Station Norfolk, in the beginning of 2025, he also had assaulted another woman who was a civilian in his barracks. And his roommates were the one that heard this happen and heard what was happening inside the room, kind of didn't think that it was... They were kind of curious and wondering what was happening, and the roommates had barged into the room, and they found this girl on the floor in a precarious position, and she was screaming for help. And for the roommates then to report that, again, a civilian woman, not even a woman who was in the service, a woman who had just come to base and was visiting. And so those are not all of the stories, but just some of the instances in which he was being investigated for. And that was just, the most recent of those assaults was just days before Angelina Resendiz was killed in May of last year. Again, just days before Angelina. And so another question that Esmeralda Castle has, another question that LULAC has, is that if all these investigations were happening and we kind of knew the severity of the assaults and we kept seeing that there were assaults rolling in, why wasn't he in pretrial confinement before the death of a sailor? Which I think is the crux of this case that has everybody up in arms over it.
And rightfully so.
Rightfully
so. Yeah, I mean, and this is a case where when you listen to all that, you say this is not going to stop until what happened.
Unfortunately.
Yeah, and so the Navy still has a lot of questions to answer about their process and how they handle investigations like this, and whether or not they keep people still in the common areas or interacting with everyone else on the ship or in the barracks or whatever. There's still a lot of questions, and I know that I remember both Tim Kaine and Mark Warner commenting on this situation, and don't know how many answers they got, with the letters that they wrote. But I can see why the mother, Miss Castle, is still really fighting. And even after this plea agreement that happens, if it happens that way, this is still going to be a case that a lot of people are going to be talking about and pushing to get answers.
Well, Janet, those multiple letters that have been written to Congress have gone unanswered. And that's why I think the family, again, is still so upset and discouraged about this. And I spoke with Marshall Griffin, too, about the Navy's process and all of this. And at first, he had told me that basically the representative who was on this case was someone who was younger, not as experienced, didn't really have much experience in way of dealing with family members. And so the communication between the Navy and Esmeralda Castle ended up getting really heated and really fueled because the person who was handling the case just really wasn't adept to handle something with such severity. And Marshall Griffin said once they had reported that and kind of complained about it, they had gotten a new rep from the Navy, and since then things have kind of worked a little bit smoother. Now, Marshall Griffin's role here is to play as kind of a bridge between the military, the Navy, and Esmeralda Castle. And you could imagine her contentious relationship right now with them. So having someone there in the middle to kind of advocate for her rights has been really something that I think that she's appreciated a lot. And I would be remiss, Janet, to not mention that over the last year, not only have we learned about the assaults of the other women in the time that Copeland was in the Navy, but we've also learned of multiple instances and reported instances that happened in Washington State before he was even in the service.
Because that's where he grew up, right?
Yes. And so there was a longtime girlfriend that he had that had accused him of assault and had filed an inquiry or a report of something that had happened. There were no formal charges that went with that. And then there was another young woman whose father had filed charges against Copeland because he had assaulted her under the family's roof. And the family didn't know about it. And she was getting blackmailed at school. And that ended up being a situation where Copeland ended up having to change high schools, and before the charges could formally be brought against him, he turned 18 and aged out of the system. And so the prosecutor there kind of said, well, he's 18 now, there's kind of this block in the case, and also he wants to join the military, and if he wants to join the military, then that could be a right course of rectifying his actions. But in the situations and in the times in which I had spoken to both that first initial girlfriend of Copeland back in high school who had filed that report, I'd spoken to her, and also the family member of this other young woman that I'm mentioning. Speaking with them, they also feel discouraged too, because this was reported how many years ago? Before he was even in the Navy, there was a trail behind him of assault. And yes.
A trail. It's just amazing. And have you ever spoken to anyone in his family?
No, we have not been able to reach out or get in contact with anyone in his family. Pretty quickly after all of this happened, Jermiah Copeland's mother's Facebook was actually public. And so she had been in the past posting pictures and talking about a little of the situation, but not really mentioning things in detail. But it was pretty soon after all of this started coming out. The previous assaults also came out. That her Facebook and all of her social media and all of her contacts have kind of gone silent. So we haven't heard from anybody on Copeland's side of this right now. So I think that's another reason why people are so on their edge of their seat to possibly hear this plea agreement and hear straight from Copeland's mouth about what happened, because it's the first time that we're getting his potentially point of view of this, and hearing from his camp. So again, we haven't been able to get in contact with any of his people, but we knew before Copeland's name was even released that there were multiple other people in the service at Naval Station Norfolk who had come forward and said, hey, we believe it's this guy because he's got a history of assault. So it was, from what we've learned from the people who've reported to us, his name before we even reported it, because we waited a while before we even reported his name, because even though his name was floating around, we want to make sure that we're doing our due diligence and not accusing somebody of something that didn't happen.
Right.
So we waited formally until the Navy had released that name, which took a couple months, knowing that he was arrested just days after Angelina was allegedly killed. And so, again, knowing all of this information and knowing that we might get to hear from Copeland, I think that what Esmeralda Castle is hoping for is just that moment of accountability.
Accountability. Amazing reporting, Madison.
Thank you.
Good job. And, of course, we here thank you. And I'm sure Esmeralda Castle appreciates, the attention that you're bringing to this issue and not letting it go, because there are still so many unanswered questions, clearly. And I hope that, this is a case where you wonder, and I know we're a long way away from Washington State, but you wonder what may have happened in this young man's life, whether or not this could be a case that is studied in such a way that you kind of figure out how you might be able to help someone else before something like this happens.
Well, and when we learned about the instances that had happened and we got those court records from those initial instances back in Washington State, I did do an interview with Samaritan House to maybe talk about how can you tell that there are warning signs, or how can you tell that there are some things to possibly look for. And unfortunately, there's just not too many. At the end of the day, they told me that we need to believe the stories that we're told when people are coming forward and divulging some of the most impactful or terroristic kind of events that have happened to them in their life. And there really is no blueprint in sitting down and figuring out, hey, we could have noticed this, and that. Unfortunately, it's all a type of retrospective angle here, and you can't kind of put together that puzzle until you have all the pieces. And unfortunately, this puzzle picture got a little grim, and unfortunately has been a little grim. And I think that now that we're seeing that whole puzzle, instead of just the assault here, it's painting a bigger picture of a narrative of how we can move forward and address not just assault in the military, but assault of someone who is a young possible offender and might grow up to then think that the military is a good avenue for themselves. What are some other right causes of action that we can take in order to get people like that help before someone is killed?
Before someone is killed, this story is so much more than Angelina Resendiz. She is just the unfortunate victim of a narrative that is a lot bigger, and that can spread out in such a way that it helps other people, that it prevents tragedies like this. And so it's just a matter of being able to, and Ms. Castle, she's doing that, placing the focus, and that's what's amazing too, not just on herself, but on the bigger picture.
Well, I say from Washington State to Washington, D.C., this is how far this case has spanned. Because as of even last week or the week before, Esmeralda Castle was in Washington, D.C. doing advocacy work for other family members of service members who have fallen or have been assaulted. So she's not stopping. She doesn't plan on stopping.
Yeah.
I did speak with her about that 1-year anniversary, and she said that time to her hasn't even really passed.
Standing still.
Yes, she said, someone told me that it has been a year, and it doesn't feel like that, because she doesn't plan on stopping anytime soon. And the advocacy work that she's doing, I think, is really shedding a light on some of the systematic issues that we've got, and the reaction that she's gotten from, again, Congress members, movers and shakers of Washington, D.C. That was not her first Washington, D.C. trip, you know, and I don't fancy that will be her last.
No, not at all.
But, well, I've got one last sound in the can that Samantha
Yes,
can
please.
pull up, and
Yes.
this is a reaction of Esmeralda Castle. When I did ask her about that 1-year mark, and I asked her, did you maybe think 1 year ago when all this happened, the gravitas that this case would hold? And so this is kind of what she's had to say about what the last year has been like for her.
Okay.
Like I've not realized that it's been a year. It was brought to my attention, like, you know, it's almost been a year. I'm like, dude, it's almost been a year, and we've done a lot in a year, and there's still a lot, you know, to be done.
Side of that, she did say too, you know, it's just, I see the sun up and I see the sun come down. And for me, I just try to find the moments where I can live in the sunlight. And that was really, really powerful to hear.
Yeah, that is powerful. Wow. God bless her. Yeah, God bless her. And my heart just goes out to her. And we will find out what happens on, you said June 8th, right?
June 8th and June 9th is when that court date is scheduled at Naval Station Norfolk.
Yeah, Naval Station. I know you will be there.
I will be there. It's a Monday, Tuesday. I will be there.
All right. Thank you so much, Madison.
Thanks,
and
Janet.
good work.
Thank
good
you.
work.